the Right Excellent and Right Honorable Sir Kennedy Alphonse Simmons, National Hero, faculty and staff, UWI alumni and friends of the University of the West Indies, the media, a pleasant good evening. We are gathered today to celebrate 70 years of the University of the West Indies. 70 years of service, 70 years of leadership. The number 70 is a very significant number for those of us who are attuned to the Bible. 70 years denotes strength. It is said that 70 for those who are strong. And the university, having come 70, can be considered a strong institution that has, over those 70 years, trained, educated many persons in the region and outside of the region. People who today are contributing to the development of the region, and some are contributing to the development outside the region. It has not only educated people in mind, but educated them as well in character. Because there is no good sense, really, to be educated in mind and not in character. It was Theodore Roosevelt who said that to educate a man in mind or woman in mind and not in morals is to educate a menace to the society. So we are gathered today to celebrate this milestone on Emancipation Day, a very significant day in our history. And we may ask ourselves, what does emancipation mean? Well, a truly educated person must be an emancipated person. A truly educated person must be an emancipated person. In every sense of the word. It was Bob Marley who sang, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery." None but ourselves can free our minds. And that is basically what education does. It frees our minds. Our minds must not be shackled or entangled. Our minds must be open, open to the world, open to others around us, open to different cultures, different ideas, different perspectives, different political ideologies. That is what it means to have a mind that is not enslaved. Our minds must be open to love, even those who we find difficult to love. Because if we have a mind open to hate, to discord, to prejudice, then our minds are not emancipated. And so today the challenge for us on this day, as the university celebrates 70 years of service and 70 years of leadership, is to reflect on how emancipated we truly are. Not only in mind, but in heart and in spirit. I now call on Mr. Akeem Alexander of the St. Kitts and Nevis Youth Parliament Association to give the Emancipation Proclamation.
Pleasant good night. Whereas an act has been passed by His Majesty with the advice and consent of the Lord Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in the Parliament of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland assembled for the abolition of slavery brought out by British colonies for promoting the industry of the manumitted slaves and for compensating the person hitherto entitled to the service of such slaves, and whereas it has appeared to His Majesty expedient to adopt the most effectual measures for preventing any misapprehensions which might appear amongst any class of His faithful subjects in the colonies aforesaid, respecting the effect of the said act and for allaying any excitement which might thereby be produced. His Majesty's subject inhabiting the said colonies and to all others whom it doth or concern, that until the first day of August, which will be in the year 1834, the laws at present in force, such in colonies respectively for the government of the slaves therein, will remain in full force and effect, and unaltered by the said Act of Parliament, and that upon from the said first day of August 1844, all persons who shall then be only registered as slaves in such respective colonies, and who shall then be actually within the same, and who shall be of full age of 6 years or upwards, will be forced, and virtue of the said Act of Parliament, become apprentice laborers in the service of the person previously entitled to their services as slaves, and that the apprenticeship of such laborers will terminate on the first day of August 1838. According to the nature and description of the employment in which laborers shall be severally engaged, as in the said act, set and description of the employment in which laborers shall be severely engaged, as in the said act set forth, and that such apprentice laborers will, during such their apprenticeships, be bound by law to labor in the service of their respective employers on such terms and conditions and for such limited periods of time, as by the said Act of Parliament, or as by acts hereafter to be made and passed in such colonies respectively, are or shall be prescribed in that behalf. And His Majesty doth further proclaim and make known that subject to such apprenticeship as aforesaid, all persons who on the first day of August 1834 shall be held in slavery within any of the colonies aforesaid will upon and from that day be absolutely and forever manumitted and set free, and that from the said 1st of August 1834, slavery is and will be abolished and unlawful throughout the said colonies, and His Majesty doth declare and make known that His Majesty had, in pursuance of the powers in him vested by the said Act of Parliament, constituted and appointed the commissioners therein mentioned for awarding to the proprietors of such manumitted slaves the compensation thereby provided for such proprietors of such manumitted slaves the compensation thereby provided for such proprietors. And His Majesty does strictly charge and admonish all his faithful subjects within the said colonies that they demean themselves submissively to the laws aforesaid, and especially that all persons now in the state of slavery in the said colonies do until the first day of August 1834 continue peaceably to perform the duties owing by them as such slaves to their respective masters as aforesaid. And His Majesty doth hereby make known and declare his settled purpose and resolve by all the powers appreciation of the economic value of such a challenge. Thank you.
That was very long, but nonetheless a very significant act for claiming the emancipation of slaves, of course, in 1834. And of course, it mentioned as well the 4-year period after of apprenticeship, which would take it up to, of course, 1838. And when we reflect on that act, of course, the abolition of the slave trade, which was really abolished because it was no more of such economic value to some of these metropolitan countries, not because it was done on such moral grounds, but at the very same time today, we still have all forms of slavery and modern day slavery. You still hear about slavery in Africa, in Libya. You hear about trafficking in persons and all that sort of a thing, people working in inhumane conditions and all of those forms of slavery. And we have to remind ourselves that really and truly, God is not a God of slavery, because we know that story from the book of Exodus, when the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt by Pharaoh, and the Lord led them out of Egypt from the brutal hand of Pharaoh through the Red Sea and so on. And yet what happened? They still went on to enslave themselves. Still their minds were not emancipated. They wanted to go back to Egypt where they can get the fat meat and all kinds of things like that. As soon as they met a little hardship, they said, Lord, but why you didn't leave us back in, leave us in Egypt? So there's a lot to reflect on this day in terms of emancipation and what it really is. We will now have the university song, There Is a Light, that will be played by the DJ.
Destiny.
Wonderfully done. I now call on Mrs. Sarah Owen, who is the Deputy Director, Acting, UWI Open Campus, to give greetings on behalf of the UWI Vice Chancellor, Professor Hilary Beckles.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Kindly allow me to adopt the protocol established by our chair. As we gather here to celebrate Emancipation Day, UWI Global Giving Week, and the 70th anniversary of the University of the West Indies, I must begin with a sincere expression of gratitude to His Excellency, Sir Tapley Seaton, for serving as patron of UWI Global Giving Week in St. Kitts and Nevis, and hosting us once again this year. Thank you so very much. This gratitude is given in equal measure to an expression of apology on behalf of our Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Open Campus, Dr. Luz Longsworth, and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Alan Cobley, all of whom made a significant attempt to join us here this evening, but there is so much festivity in the Eastern Caribbean that flights from Jamaica and Barbados were just not possible. There's a lot going on to celebrate, and we're celebrating here this evening as well, so I'm going to crave your indulgence as I offer a few remarks on their behalf. Nellie Stromquist draws reference to, and I quote, "The central premise that higher education should contribute to the creation of an emancipatory social project aimed at the reduction of economic inequalities and the promotion of social justice and democratic governance," end quote. The UWI, like most institutions in the region committed to this emancipatory project, faces challenges that must be considered within the context of finite resources and prioritized needs. To effectively operate within this context, the UWI has adopted a strategic approach to institutional planning that is captured in the AAA strategy under the theme Revitalizing Caribbean Development. These goals are intricately linked to the institution's mission and vision, as well as national and regional policies and ideals. In 1996, and I'm really hoping this is going to sound familiar to most, CARICOM approved a statement on the characteristics of the ideal Caribbean person. Jules posits, and I quote, "This statement identifies the essential characteristics of the ideal Caribbean person and ought to be adopted as one of the philosophical aims of education in the region," end quote. Though debates abound on the concept of the ideal, these characteristics form an important starting point for the consideration of priority needs in regional education. In considering the ideal person as the intended output of the educational system, the missions and visions of the sector should be aligned with achieving the characteristics identified, not only at the regional level, but also at the national and institutional levels. This multi-level alignment is underscored by CARICOM in 2017 in its articulation of the need for a harmonized approach to training throughout member states to meet the human resource development objectives required to transform regional economies. The primary impediment to meeting the goals identified by most regional institutions, including ours, even when well aligned to regional and national strategies, is limited finances. All other resource constraints are generally nested within this overarching challenge. The United States National Center for Education Statistics 2018 suggests, and I quote, "A country's wealth, defined as GDP per capita, is positively associated with its education expenditures per full-time education student at the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary levels," end quote. The conundrum of financing regional education is thus clearly defined in the juxtaposition of the nation's source of wealth, the education sector, and the education sector's source of revenue, the nation. Nested within this reality of financial resource constraints are the challenges affecting human resources within the region. Combining the two, CADAN 2018 considers the effects of human capital constraints on innovation required to drive regional economies. His analysis concludes that within the private sector, firms are less likely to engage in innovation where there is an absence of new skilled employees, as well as educational mismatches to managerial and professional level job types. The human resource challenge for regional educational leaders is thus complex. They must consider not only the human resources required to drive innovation at the institution, but the extent to which the said resources are preparing the region's learners to drive economic development required to stimulate all sectors, including education. The interconnectedness of these concepts makes it difficult for leaders in education to consider resource allocations in isolation. This careful dance between limitations and priorities brings us here together this evening. The UWI emerged in 1948, Oriens Ex Occidente Lux, a light shining or rising in the West. 70 years later, we boast growth from 33 medical students in Jamaica to near 50,000 students in hundreds of programs throughout the region and now the wider world through the institution's global expansion. This expansion has been executed through partnerships in New York, Soju, Lagos, and Johannesburg in fields such as leadership, computer science, and diaspora studies. The institution remains committed to its mission to advance learning, create knowledge, and foster innovation for the positive transformation of the Caribbean and the wider world. And we seek your continuing support as we encourage all alumni and friends to adopt the UWI Global Giving mantra: emancipate, educate, donate. Thank you.
Which word stood out more for you? Emancipate, donate, or educate? Which one? Donate? This is UWI Global Giving. You know, so if donate stands out, that is pretty good. But it doesn't mean that the other two are any less. We will now have some reflections by past students of the University of the West Indies. I suppose they are ideal persons. You mentioned that the outcome for the university is the ideal person. But we can ask, who is the ideal person? And what are those ideals? Well, today we can say that the ideal person is an emancipated person. We can say that. And so we call firstly on Dr. Keith Archibald to give his reflection from the 1960s. I wasn't born yet. Welcome, Dr. Archibald.
I wish I could be as fit as my dear brother from school days, Sir Kennedy Simmons.